William.
So no one yet. Okay.
I'm trying to remember. I think the picture for the article, if I recall correctly, came from Dr. Labor. I think it's a Mexican picture.
So yeah, so this is what I mean. So like, there's clearly someone watching on YouTube because they commented, but it still says like no. Okay, there we go. 4 people.
Okay.
And like I said, don't worry too much about the numbers. So hello, we are here with a Zero Books Capital Comrades special. We have myself, Conrad Hamilton. I think by this point, I'm probably a familiar face, perhaps familiar, all too familiar to some of our viewers. And we also have Matthew McManus, who is a writer for Jacobin, Aereo, Marion West, and a range of other publications. And recently we collaborated on an article for Aereo, which might be a surprising repository to sort of put forth Marxist writing. But we collaborated on an article called Karl Marx on Value.
The most inventive title of the world, right?
Yeah. And that deals with Karl Marx's labor theory of value. Well, I put that sort of in quotation marks because, as is well known, Marx did not ever use the term labor theory of value. And that's a lot of what our article dwells on, the way that even the notion of Marx is straightforwardly having a labor theory of value, in which, according to the sort of common misconception, value directly embodies the amount of time you put into making goods, doesn't do justice to the actual complexity of his theory. So there's been a lot of right-wing pundits, for example, who've caricatured it. And without saying unequivocally that both of us believe that, that there's no problems with the labor theory of value, what we've tried to do is elucidate it in a fair and rigorous way.
That's for sure.
So do you want to talk about so generally, like, I sort of wrote Matt sort of wrote the first part of the article, and then I wrote the second part of the article. So Matt, do you want to talk about just give a summary of your part of the article then?
Sure. Well, what inspired me to kind of initiate this project, and I'm very happy we could collaborate on it together, right, was some bad right-wing pieces on Marx's theory of value, and there are a dime a dozen, and we cited a few of them in the piece, right? But at a more, I suppose you could say, sophisticated level, I was interested in responding to people like Ian Shapiro, who's a Yale political scientist, who characterized Marx as, quote, a minor post-Lockean. And I call him a minor post-Lockean because he feels that Marx is still beholden to the workmanship ideal articulated by people like Locke, which ultimately leads him to have this labor theory of value and entitlement. And there's really nothing that he adds that's all that interesting when it comes to account of value and labor that you can find in better classical political economists. And what I thought was really important to stress was the dialectical quality of his account of value as articulated in Capital. So a lot of what I wrote about in the piece was how we have to understand value, not in terms of intrinsic value coming from labor, but in terms of the socio-historical conditions and the epoch in which a particular theory of value comes to prominence. And this is, of course, the dialectical way of approaching things. And what I thought was really interesting when you look at Marx's writing is he's very expressive about this. So one of the points that he makes that I think was quite brilliant was Aristotle wasn't able to develop an account of value and reflect on its association with labor because he lived in a slave society, right? So the ideological barriers that were intrinsic to the time period prevented him from coming to this realization. Whereas what's interesting about the bourgeois epoch, at least as far as he's concerned, is, of course, we've reached a stage in the dialectic of history where bourgeois political economists like Adam Smith or David Ricardo were able to express the point that there's some intrinsic connection between labor and the value of commodities sold at market. But what I wanted to push against, of course, was the idea that Marx says that this is necessarily the way value should be understood in all historical time periods, right? Because, of course, in a communist epoch or in a socialist future, while there will still be some connection between labor and value, it'll be far more complicated than what we, it'll be far different from what we see in the capitalist age.
Okay, so you want me to pick up from there?
Yeah, that was my kind of motivation.
Sure.
And yes, you should vote for Biden.
Yeah. So my part of the article dealt with, it picks up, at the end of a section that Matt had written most of. And what it deals with heavily is the question of the sort of the history of the notion of value, or the equivocation between labor and value. And this is actually a very complex subject within Marxism. But the reading I sort of elected for there is the view of value is in a sense, or labor is in a sense, have always been having been the substratum of value, but as that having been crystallized and articulated within the context of the capitalist mode of production, right? So in other words, you were talking about this passage in which Marx discusses the way that Aristotle couldn't recognize that labor was the basis of value because he lived in a slave-owning society. I mean, that's not just a question of recognition, right? It's also a question of the fact that, once you have a sort of uniformly free labor force, right, that's equipped with, similar instruments of production and so forth, then you actually have people falling under the law of value, right? And then this becomes apparent, right? But it's an interesting kind of Hegelian process, right? Because its apparency becomes clear at the same moment as it's actually being, or as it's actually being historically articulated, right?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the brilliant things about Marx's dialectical approach, right? And it's a really tricky thing to sort out, of course, since sometimes when we talk about Marx's dialectic, it's not always clear whether or not we're talking about a materialist dialectic that's actually taking place in front of our eyes, or whether we're talking about a methodological approach. And one of the things that's tricky about this is, of course, is that Marx will often interchangeably make dialectical observations without ever really clarifying in which sense he's intending the dialectical approach to be understood, right? And what I think is brilliant about the passage about Aristotle, of course, is the fact that from the standpoint of dialectical materialism, we can now recognize how there were ideological limitations to his way of thinking about things that were circumscribed by the mode of production that he happened to live within.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so this is interesting, right? Yeah, this theory is more descriptive of capitalism than the whole history of labor. Certainly, I agree with that, right? But I would just add to that I think there's been a strong tendency, within Marxist discourse in recent years to sort of stress the absolute specificity of abstract labor to the capitalist mode of production, right? You see this in Postone and people like that. But I favor a slightly different view, which I think is supported by a lot of the passages that in Capital, in which Marx describes labor as sort of being progressively abstracted historically, right, in the movement toward capitalism, right? So it's not exclusive to that.
Yeah, I notice Daniel has a question about the difference between a materialist dialectic and a methodological dialectic. I actually wrote a paper on this for Cultural Logic some time ago, but I took my interpretation of this from Greg Albo, who's a Marxist at York University. And the way that he characterizes Marx methodology, dialectical methodology, is as follows, right? You start from the abstract, right? And then you move to what he calls the concrete, and you move then ultimately to the concrete in thought, right? And the way it proceeds is this, right? Abstract thinking might take something like exchange as it exists to be a permanent feature of the world that we live in, right? But gradually, of course, once we historicize this and we look at empirical evidence about how exchange has changed over time, we develop a more sophisticated account, right? And ultimately, you need to proceed to a further step, which is recognizing that our whole notion of exchange and its historicity is dependent on interpreting the phenomena dialectically, right? And that's where you move to the concrete of thought, as Albo puts it.
Yeah, and that critique from the contribution to the critique of political economy, that quote from the contribution to the critique of political economy, the concrete in thought, has long been a sort of provocation for Marxists who are trying to develop sort of epistemological ideas, right? So some people accept that there's a sort of like more rationalist standpoint through which you could access the understanding of history, whereas other people think of this notion of the concrete in thought in a way as maybe obscuring the degree to which all thought is conditioned by the mode of production. Yeah.
Absolutely, right. And it's a tricky thing, of course, since Marx never wrote down what his methodology is, right? He never actually even really wrote a purely philosophical tract that will help answer some of these questions for us, right? Which is why I think it's so important to actually delve into his work to try to extract its methodological innovations from the kind of concrete examples and examinations he engages in.
Mm-hmm. So I'll just continue a little bit into, I guess, the two sort of main points that I made after that. But one point just had to do with the role that technology plays in the creation of value. So, a common critique of Marx's system is that he doesn't account for the capacity of technology to generate value, as it were, right? And we have to, if you really want to understand why, in a sense, this is the case, though we're going to explain it's a bit more complicated. You have to delve into Marx's work and try to understand his reasoning a little bit. So, like Marx in general, in his analysis of capitalism, he supposes that technological inputs, or constant capital, as you'd say, are essentially generalized in such a way that they become standard across an industry, right? So for that reason, when he goes to actually calculate value, he doesn't think of that as being sort of the nucleus of how value functions, right? For him, the nature of labor power, right, the fact that labor power is what's purchased, not labor, right, means that in a sense labor is always structurally undervalued. So that's the real basis of value, right? But that having been said, what he does acknowledge is that in cases where you have, let's say, exclusive access to a certain kind of technological instrument, for example, and actually you could say this of any input, right? So if you're a Saudi Arabian oil company and you have special access to a certain oil site, for example, it'd be the same thing, right? What you're able to do is actually valorize that as surplus labor, right? And to increase profits accordingly. So again, this is an aspect of Marx. I feel like people often don't get into the reasoning of this. You can dispute it, but I think there is something to what he's saying, the tendency of technological inputs to generalize. And keep in mind that capital is a sort of abstract dialectical model of capitalism, right?
And I think it's also really important to note that the point about technology also explains why it is that capitalism is a highly competitive system. Because as something like Shapiro point out, if you look at Marx's analysis in Capital Volume 1 at the very least, the capitalists aren't afraid of the workers. They're afraid of other capitalists, right? And the reason, of course, is because technological change will allow some to get an edge over their competitors, which means they might be put out of business, which means you always need to stay current with whatever the latest technology is, right? And Marx has this very sophisticated and interesting take on it because, of course, he says this accounts in no small part for the dynamism of capitalism, right? And its tremendous productive capacity, right? But it also shows you in really tremendous detail, right, why it is that this push to technologically innovate upends establishing traditional modes of living while at the same time creating a huge amount of instability in the capitalist economic system. So I think, on the point of technology is really well taken. And it doesn't just, it's not important just because it has such relevance to its account of value and socially necessary labor time, but because it explains a tremendous amount about his kind of broader sociological examinations.
Yeah. And also, Daniel Jacobs asked, what does it mean that labor is always structurally undervalued? Well, when I say always, right, it's actually general, it's tendential, right? So Marx alludes to the fact that there are exceptions, when the value of labor power, can rise to the level of the value of labor, for example, right? But in general, the sort of way capitalism functions, right, is that it pays people for the value of their labor power, right? Not, which is defined in terms of, again, it can be subject to a great deal of variation, right? But, the model that is most commonly alluded to through capital is the idea that this is set in relation to the needs of the labor force, right? Which Marx admits are themselves historically variable as well, right? But again, there's a discrepancy between the needs of the labor force in many cases, and the value that's actually being generated by their labor, right? So the point is, the use of constant capital to as surplus labor, right? The valorization of it in a manner that creates increased profits is possible. And Marx even says when technologies are first introduced, there's a stage, right, in which super profits are created, right? But this is not the essential means, right, through which capitalism produces value, right? And that's the reason why Marx leans heavily upon leans strongly upon the category of labor, right, when he's formulating a theory of value, right?
There's a good question here. If capitalists weren't afraid of the workers, why would they replace them with machines when they go on strike? That's a good question, right? I think the point that Shapiro is making in his analysis of Capital Volume 1 isn't that, capitalists as a class are concerned with class conflict, right? Since, of course, the whole job of the state is to a certain extent mediate that or mollify the propensity of the working classes to revolt, right? The point that Shapiro makes with reference to Capital Volume 1 is that you're the average capitalist sitting at their desk trying to think about how to make a profit. They're not really minding all those kinds of issues. It's kind of in the background if they're really cognizant of it all. What they're concerned about, of course, is outcompeting the guy down the street, right? Who's in the same industry as them, which is precisely why it is that they feel such a drive to innovate, right? So that they can extract more from their exploitation of labor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but of course, the paradox of innovation in this case, right, is that by shifting the ratio of the organic composition of capital, Marx proposes that the result of this is a tendential fall in the rate of profit, right? So this need to sort of keep up pace, right, creates this difficulty, and this is very palpable, right? If you look at, a field like video games, right, where we have like Konami fired Kojima, right, and said, we're not doing the Metal Gear Solid series anymore. Well, of course, Metal Gear Solid games, they make a large mass of profit, but I don't think that the rate of profit is particularly desirable, right? And I think having one person, cheaply program like a mobile application, right, which is the kind of thing they went and invested in instead, right, is far preferable in that respect. So that's not a scientific example by any means, but you begin to tease out what Marx is trying to get at.
It is a cool example, though. I mean, I never really thought about Metal Gear Solid that way, right? But one of the things that I think, because I have about 20 minutes left, is what I think is really innovative about this account is precisely how much more sophisticated it is than even earlier classical political economists, with the partial exception of somebody like Adam Smith, right? Because I think Adam Smith's take is actually quite nuanced, even if it's not as semantically coherent as Marx's. But if you look at the kind of strides that he took on somebody like David Ricardo, let alone somebody like Locke, right, and unpacking the historicity of how we should understand this account of value, there's just really no comparing the levels of sophistication, right? Which is part of the reason why I think this critique has proven evergreen. One of the reasons, again, that I thought about writing this was Martin Haglund in his excellent book, This Life, which is kind of a leftist existentialist manifesto for the 21st century. He thinks the labor theory of value and the Marxist critique is more salient now than it never has been before. And I have some disputes with him on that. But what's remarkable about that is how it is that 2 centuries after he wrote the text, it's still finding fresh converts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing about that too, right? Like if you believe this sort of theory whereby, and again, we have different, very different theories of value are proposed, right? Mm-hmm. So for Engels, like value and labor are more equivocal, right? Sort of at the dawn of civilization, right? Whereas in sort of the new reading that's been popular over the last 30 years, it's the opposite, right? Where the relationship between value and labor is brought about most strongly by the capitalist mode of production, right? Or really consummated by that. But one of the consequences of this is that if you believe the new reading, for example, and in a way, this is sort of anecdotally supported by just, the fact that, even industrial apparatuses are far more distributed and available, around today, right, in China or India or whatever than ever before. What that would lead you to believe is that the conditions of our world today are actually much closer than the abstract conditions, because most of the world was not capitalist, right? Industrial capitalist and Marx wrote Capital, that then in the time Marx was writing, right? So there's a certain argument you can make that these are actually more relevant, not less, right?
Oh, absolutely, right. One of the things that I think we should talk about very briefly, since our article was criticized in some circles for this, is we didn't talk very much about the distinction he makes at the opening of Capital between use value and exchange value, right? Okay. Because I know a number of people were commenting on this, right?
I thought you did talk about that, but yeah.
What?
I thought you did talk about that in the article, but yeah.
I did talk about it in the article, right? But I mean, it wasn't the centerpiece, right? Because I said because we had a lot of other stuff to do. But my interpretation of Marx's account of use value and exchange value is that, of course, there's a dialectical relationship between the two, right? So something doesn't have exchange value unless it has use value, right? But that doesn't necessarily. I mean, I can't sit there and just paint a rock and sell it for millions of dollars, right? Because nobody would have any use value from that, right? But the point is that there's a disjunction between the two, right? And my interpretation of use value is that it's further complicated, of course, because Marx seems sensitive to the fact that utility is subjective in some senses, right? And I'm not sure what your thoughts are on this, but I've never been able to really make heads or tails about how he tries to cash out a critique of utilitarianism through an examination of use value, since that seems in part what he's trying to do when he criticizes people like J.S. Mill and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't examined his writings on that heavily. So you're asking me how he would critique a sort of utilitarian theory of value.
Yeah, this is why, right? Because I mean, one of the points that Marxists frequently make when they talk about use value, right, is that neoclassical political economists going forward, right, lean too heavily on a utilitarian account of value, which is subjective, right, as opposed to the idea of socially necessary labor time, which has a more objective connotation, right? And I think that Marx was sensitive to some of these difficulties with the concept of use value, right? But nonetheless, he still opens the book by talking about it. And he doesn't directly seem to talk about it all that often in the other volumes of Capital, but he does criticize utilitarians quite consistently, right, for having a kind of tendentious account of value. And I figured maybe you would know more about this than I do, so I was hoping to hear your thoughts.
Well, without dwelling too much on the relationship to utilitarianism, I mean, I think one thing about it is that one way of looking at it is that he's acknowledging that but bracketing it, right? And in relation to the history of commodity production or capitalism or whatever, right? So he's saying, well, this exists, right? But this is not the basis of value. But I think another interesting thing about the relationship between use value and exchange value in Marx is often we have this idea of like, and this was especially characteristic of older readings of Marx, this idea that like, use value is, sort of like the real essence of the thing, right?
Yeah.
But even if you look at like the Grundrisse, I think at one point Marx says like, in a way, like use values themselves are formally determined by their relationship to exchange values, right? So if you look like in our society, if you look at, nature as a use value, right? Even if it is outside of exchange value, it's still essential, right? The idea that could be taken as an externality, right? And then used, right, for the expansion of capital accumulation. And you see a similar thing with socially reproductive labor, right? Women's labor, and it's not directly remunerated, right, or brought into the immediately market-mediated sphere, to quote Maya Gonzalez. But it's still essential that it be organized in a way, right? So I think that, again, a lot of what my work has sort of dealt with is the idea that, in a way, there's a complicity in the organization of both exchange values and use values, right, to the system. Yeah,
the reason I bring this up is because one of the more savvy critiques by some conservative critics, like Alistair McIntyre, right, is that Marx is essentially a utilitarian. He just doesn't acknowledge it, right? And the argument McIntyre makes is this, right, that Marx believed in a communist society, things would be recognized in terms of their use value, unlike in a capitalist society where we essentially fetishize things according to exchange value, which means that their real use gets distorted, right? And so I think there are real political stakes to this discussion, right? And I think that's a bad reading of Marx, right? Precisely because I don't think that he really wants to buy in to an account of use value, which says that all human beings want is to get as much utility as possible, right, from objects. I think that in some senses, he feels that it's actually important for us to develop all sides of our nature. So there's a romantic quality to the normative underpinnings of his theory that people who criticize Marx like McIntyre don't really get when they say that he's just kind of a closet utilitarian.
Yeah, and you have to apply a dialectical reading of this too, because like, it would be pretty trivial in a Hegelian sense, but true, I think, to observe that, like both terms in the use value, exchange value binary are mutually dependent, right? If you don't have either, then you have no value, right? Which is different than use value, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something we often don't acknowledge. One thing I should discuss here, I should discuss just the last major point I sort of made in that. One thing that's very, very commonly overlooked in Marx's work, because one thing people will say is, well, how is it the case that, if Marx sees, constant capital as being, in a sense, like a dead weight, right, upon value production, or potentially that in many cases, how is it the case that, a firm that has, spends a relatively low amount of money, right, or is not labor intense, how could they compete with a more labor intense business, right? So the solution Marx uses or attempts to use, because it's not finished, right? It was published posthumously in the third volume of Capital, is he basically argues that there's a discrepancy between value and price that emerges here, right? So in other words, when goods are brought to market by firms that are labor intensive, they're actually priced below their value, right? Whereas when goods are brought to market by firms that are less labor intensive, they're actually priced above their value, which lets them suck up the surplus value, right? That's being created by the other firms. But again, and this is one thing we stress in the article as well. A big problem with this is that Marx never develops a sort of clear-cut formula, right, whereby you could link, firmly establish the relationship between value and price, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that had he lived a little bit longer, he wouldn't have been able to accomplish that, right? Since I think that particularly some of the unfinished chapters of Volume 3, you start to see him start teasing around some solutions to that, right? But part of the problem, I think, is that people don't appreciate that, of course, as a good dialectical observer, right? The volumes of capital are always in motion, right? Since Marx is never trying to just describe capital in essentialist terms, he's always describing it as it's evolving in front of him, right? So who knows what he would have said, had he lived into the 20th and now the 21st century, right? I imagine that he would have written a very different book had he lived today, in part because he probably would have addressed across some of the comments things like sign value that people like Baudrillard think are so significant. I think the last thing that we should address just before we go, I know this seems like a very stupid thing to do, but a number of people criticized our article saying that talking about Marx or talking about how there's any kind of value in Marx's account is the equivalent of saying that we should find something of use or find some insights in Mein Kampf. You might remember that comment on our area article. And so I just thought that we should try to maybe talk about what we think the use or the utility of this account of value is now, why we still have so much to learn from it. So why don't you go first?
Yeah. Well, one thing I think is that, I don't think that Marx ever fully nails the formulation. And in a way, especially in terms of what I see and what many Marxists see as maybe the fatal flaw, which is the relationship between value and price. But at the same time, I think that one thing that we can see is that in terms of examining certain empirical patterns, right, it's actually quite suggestive, right? This notion that there's a strong connection between value and labor, right? So one thing I discussed, in the book was the fact that there's been a huge, all kinds of Western firms have shifted to hiring workers abroad, right? And it's interesting, right? Because often we'll say oh yeah, they're stealing our jobs, right? Which positions this entirely, in terms of the relationship between paying, a more costly American worker versus a less costly Chinese worker, right? Mm-hmm. But I think the reality is, in many cases, it seems to me that what's going on is that these companies are actually avoiding automation by doing that. And so I think, again, this is quite a general kind of idea. But I think if you look at what Marx is saying, you can begin to understand why it might be preferable, right? Even if the cost is higher in some cases, right? To employ a greater share of labor so as to avoid a situation where you are having to bring goods to market at a higher price point to compensate for the fact that value is not coming from values. You're not getting value from labor in that way, right?
Fresh living labor power. Yeah.
I also want to say as well that, and just making reference, there's been a lot of people like Ankwar Sheikh and Paul Cockshott and other people, Andrew Kleeman, who have done a lot of good sort of empirical and economic work to try to flesh out and defend and develop. And you can get people like Steve Klee, who completely changes Marx's theories to try to sort of get them working. But one thing that Paul Cockshott said was very, very interesting, right? He said that the critique against Marxist economics that was brought forth by marginalism was mostly a sort of abstract critique, right? And that it critiques sort of like the supposition, the metaphysical supposition of labor as the basis of value, and the incapacity of Marx to resolve the transformation problem and things like this. One thing he said was never actually empirically disproven, right? And he said that if you actually plug in these variables and look at them today, you can actually, labor is really, really useful for doing price predictions, for example. So I think that's really, really interesting too, that I think there's a strong practical and empirical case for these things. So I would encourage people, I think it's valid to bring up some of these criticisms. Sometimes when people say, well, why labor? Why not anything? Right? And it's like, we should try to remember that Marx was also trying to develop an empirical theory. Right. So it's not just about philosophical coherency in that way. Right. It's also about, putting forth models which are able to predict and understand economic behavior. And while I wouldn't go so far as to say that, Marx's theory in its present form bestows us with all the tools we need to do that, I think that it is conceivable that there could be a reformulation of it adequate to some of those tasks.
Absolutely. And I should say that I have my own reservations about Marx's account of labor, primarily inspired by Straffa, right? Straffa has this really good critique in his book, The Reduction of Commodities by Means of Other Commodities, right, where he says that Marx assigns a kind of special quality to labor as the one constant thing that's behind all commodities. And Straffa points out that that's not necessarily true, right? You might be able to say the same thing about food, for example, right, since all laborers need to eat, in order to produce. But what I think is germane about Marx's analysis of labor and relevant to us in the 21st century are two things, right? The first is that the dialectical approach that he takes to the notion of value remains as relevant as ever, right? And the need to kind of historicize our conceptions of value in terms of the mode of production at any given time, right? I don't think that's aged at all. I think if anything, is more relevant than ever before when we talk about how ideologically people tend to conceive of the basis of value, right? Including reactionary political economists. The other thing that I think is really insightful and really important is, of course, that, and this is still true to this day, Marx points out that a lot of people have this very cherished idea of what's sometimes called the workmanship ideal, right? That you found espoused in Locke, right? Which is the notion that, well, there's some association between labor and reward, and if you want to put it differently, between labor and entitlement, right? And there's all kinds of people today, I criticized Ben Shapiro in a Jack Wynne article for talking all kinds of nice things about Locke, but then not recognizing the parallels with Marx. Because, of course, what Marx then says is, well, if you really hold to this workmanship ideal, you should be anti-capitalist, since, of course, the people who produce most of the stuff are the ones who get very few of the rewards because of the rate of exploitation and so on. And I don't think that there are any reactionary defenders of the workmanship ideal who have ever been able to resolve this problem, right? Since they usually want to hold that there's some association between how hard someone works and what they're entitled to, without necessarily ceding the point that Marx makes, which is that, well, if you really feel that way, you'd be a critic of our society as it stands right now, right? And you still see people making all these kinds of defenses right now, which is why I think the idea still holds a lot of water as a tool to essentially bludgeon bourgeois political economists. And I should also point out that F.A. Hayek very intelligently actually once advised conservatives and classical liberals to drop any reference to the workmanship ideal precisely for this reason, and very few of them have actually taken his good advice and well-intentioned advice.
That's a pretty damning statement on capitalism, that there was an edict issued to drop the workman ideal because, like, oh wait, not going to be able to defend that in their own terms.
Well, I mean, think of somebody like a hack like Dinesh D'Souza, right? Dinesh D'Souza in his recent book criticizing socialism it seems is entirely unaware of all these problems, obviously, right? Because he doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to this or anything, right? But one of the things he overtly says, like, well, if there's no association between how hard someone works and what they get, then capitalism isn't moral and it should be replaced. And the funny thing, of course, is Marx would probably be there saying, if you really think that people should be rewarded based on how hard they work, you should absolutely get rid of capitalism, right? Because it's immoral. So I just always find those kind of things very funny. But those are the two things I take away from it, right? Using it as a tool to bludgeon the workmanship ideal, still as relevant as any before, and also this dialectical and historical approach to the very idea of exchange of value in general.
Yeah, and the workman ideal is an interesting theme there too, just because there's a great debate about this within Marxism, right? So not all Marxists by any means, right? I mean, but if you look at
not all Marxists, right?
Yeah. If you look at the history of Marxist thought, one thing that was characteristic of a lot of older forms of Marxism was a tendency to think of labor as a kind of trans-historical category, and then to think of communism as bringing about, sort of the emancipation of labor in that context, right? By a society in which labor will sort of activate its true essence, right? But again, more recently, there's been a lot of challenges to this. A lot of them have relied heavily textually on the Grundrisse, but the idea that, again, if there's a historical relationship and developmental relationship between value and labor, right, then it would suggest that the abolition of the commodity form may also involve the abolition of the category of labor as it's been hitherto conceived. And actually, even in practical politics, you see that in the left, there still is like a very, very strong attachment to the notion of labor. And I think a good example of this you can see is like when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came out swinging against universal basic income, right? So I support UBI. Like, I think Guy Standing, who invented the term precariat, has some very great economists, has some great defenses of that. But I do think you can see that there's a real hesitancy, right, to accept the idea that we shouldn't maintain labor as a basis for human dignity. So that there's a lot of debates about that too, right?
Absolutely. And I'll just close by saying I think this is also important when understanding the distinction between Marx's account of socialism and Marx's account of communism, right? Because sometimes these two are conflated, right? But in his account of a post-capitalist society, which we organized in socialist lines, one of the distinguishing features is, of course, some notion of value and labor will still persist, right? The difference being that under a socialist regime, the worker will actually receive compensation for the true value of their labor, unlike in a capitalist regime where, of course, the capitalist profits through exploitation, right? But then Marx goes on to say that that'll be different under communism, right? When, precisely as you mentioned, right, this relationship between labor and value will finally disappear completely, ossify away, and instead people will distribute resources according to the principle of, from each according to his or her abilities to each according to his or her needs, right? So I think it's more important than ever to have these kind of discussions, just to make sure that we can be clear on what Marx's distinction between socialism and communism is actually about.
For sure. Do you want to just take for 10 minutes, just take questions, and then we can sign off after that?
Sure, I can take questions. Sorry, a friend of mine had a family tragedy, so I'm going to offer my consolations. So
yeah, we'll be ending this one a little bit early just because Matt had some urgent stuff. But if you guys, we got question time now. So if you guys have any questions here, so I'm just gonna scroll through and see what we have. I'm not sure if all of these we can answer, but so we have. So capitalism helped capitalists to avoid automation to keep extracting surplus labor from third world countries. Interesting. Do you mind if I tackle that first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is really interesting because actually one of the most interesting books on this is Jason Moore's Capitalism, the Web of Life, which, the basic thesis of Moore's work is that the metaphysical sort of binary of man and nature develops in correspondence with the commodity form historically. So it can't be a basis for Marxist thinking. Yeah, one of the interesting things that Moore says, right, he talks about sort of the different cheaps, what do you think he calls them, the four cheaps or the five cheaps that capitalism requires for its reproduction. And so, like food is one of them, like energy is another one of them. And one of the ones he discusses is labor. Right? How capitalism always has this sort of thirst right, for cheap labor. And one thing he points out is that, we can talk about, if we're talking about, we often talk about our ecological crisis, right, in terms of ecological exhaustion and the difficulties that will pose for capital accumulation. But one thing we talk less about is the fact that, the sort of opening up or collapse of the communist bloc created this huge pool, right, of cheap labor that allowed capitalism to sort of get around, again, if you accept this theory, sort of the perils posed by automation, right? So you think of China as being sort of ground zero for this, right? Just this enormous cheap labor force, right? Eastern Europe as well, all over. So yeah, I think one narrative that's often deployed by certain Marxist economic thinkers is that, yeah, it was the collapse of the socialist bloc that has really provided the cheap labor necessary for capitalism to continue through that time.
There's a question about Baudrillard that someone's asking: is Baudrillard's sign value really distinct from Marx's use value? We throw that question up.
So I've read Baudrillard. Let me just pull up sign value quickly. Rather than the material value, insurance function, the primary use of the object, and the buyer of a Rolls Royce limousine might partly. Okay. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So I'm gonna, without being as well read in Baudrillard as I probably should, though I have read some books. Do you want me to tackle this, or do you want to take it?
No, I think I can talk about it, right? Okay. Baudrillard's conception of sign value actually changes quite subtly from his earliest books to his later books, right, which tend to be more radical, right, unless Marxist in their orientation, right? His early book, Towards a Political Economy of the Sign, is how it's usually discussed, is a critique of Marx, but a friendly critique, right, with the argument being that, amongst other things, right, Marx was focused on productive processes, right, and he said that there's this strong association between production and the value of something, right, and this is where labor comes in, right, and Baudrillard's comment in this text is that this is still too materially grounded to appreciate the postmodern epoch, right, because in the postmodern epoch, a lot of the things that people value are signs, right, they have a symbolic quality to them that's detached from any kind of materiality, even the materiality of productive processes, right? And you can think about things like now creating memes or creating logos, whatever it happens to be, right? And if you want, as somebody points out, Douglas Lane, amongst other Marxists, is highly critical of Baudrillard for ignoring production now and focusing on purely this kind of specular, almost idealistic concept of value, suggesting that we don't even need to talk about production anymore. All we need to do is talk about how it is that signs have a value that's kind of abstracted now away from the real world, right? And I think those are fair criticisms, right? Because somebody's still there producing symbolic content, right? And so we can't just decide to ignore that like Baudrillard sometimes does in order to make seemingly radical critiques by suggesting that everything is unreal now and so on and so forth.
Can I just add something to that? One thing that's interesting too, I think in a way, sort of the riposte or the attempt to integrate Baudrillard's comments into a more Marxist framework would come if you look at Baron and Sweezy, like Monopoly Capital, because what they basically argue is that capitalism in the post-World War II era was defined by these sort of hegemonic monopolies that were able to sort of defy the relationship between value and price, right? By having a monopoly on the products in which they sold, right? But again, I think it's very, very important, like, to understand, like, if you look at something like, Marx talks about, when he talks about super profits, he says, well, if you have a patent, for example, right, that will allow you to sort of, earn super profits, again, to earn profits in excess of what you normally would, right, based on the value being deployed. So I think if we're talking about the power of signs, I think a lot of it emerges from the sense in which, it's like in China, they make the iPhone, so obviously they can make iPhones, but, the IP, right, of Apple, right, is not owned by the Chinese companies that make it, right? So I think you can conceptualize in a certain way the importance of this kind of process of branding, right, in terms of it being an attempt to develop these models that can be used to again earn super profits in that way, right?
Absolutely. So just the last question, and then I got to go. But is Baudrillard's sign value rather like Bourdieu's idea of cultural capital? Okay. I can absolutely see why somebody would make an association between Baudrillard's concept of sign value and Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital. The way that I would push against conflating the two is that Bourdieu's idea of cultural capital, in some sense, is broader and less theory laden than Bourdieu's concept of sign value, right? So there's all kinds of different ways that one can accumulate cultural capital. So, for instance, I have a lot of cultural capital accumulated in me through an education, for example, right, which allows me to speak in a certain lingua, present myself in a certain way, and this is valuable to me as I try to navigate through late capitalism because I'm able to get a lot from the kind of cultural capital that's embedded in my personality through my education and so on and so forth, right? Baudrillard's notion of sign value, again, is more about the disconnect of symbols from any material processes and the kind of value we now ascribe to them, which he says is different than Marx, who, of course, felt that the materiality of productive processes was exactly where the exchange value of something came from, through labor power.
Mm-hmm. And can I just add one? I want to add a note to that too. I think there's a great essay by Luce Ragre in her text, The Sex Which Is Not One, called Women on the Market. And in it, she talks about the way, and she's going off Claude Lévi-Strauss's claim that women are like the first commodities that are distributed, and sort of the precondition for commodity exchange. And what she says is, like, if you look at the features or the importances which women are invested with, in a way, there's even though this is use value, in a way there's a structural homology with the commodity form, because in a sort of patriarchal organization, the fact of being able to have a woman like this reflects to a large extent your labor, right? It becomes like a demarcation of status in a way. Right. So about the question of cultural capital and Bourdieu, it's very interesting because, you have these registers of cultural capital and economic capital, but Bourdieu does treat them as kind of like fluid in a way. He says, well, you take your economic capital, if you're smart, you're going to invest it in cultural capital. Right. Now, in the United States, your likelihood of going to university is identical to the wealth of your parents. Right. So I guess what I mean is, like, whatever supposedly specific characteristics these kind of things are endowed with, like cultural capital, in a way you can bring it back down to, let's say, I'm not saying you should do this, but it's one way of thinking about it. You can bring it back down to the nucleus of value when you consider that there's a transferability, right? That there's a purchasability of those things, right? From the basis of economic value.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, it was really great chatting with you, Conrad. Thanks for having me on, and hopefully we can do this again sometime, because I can see that there's a few other questions. So who knows? Maybe in a couple months or so.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll come back. Maybe to talk about one of your articles or something else we write together. We can come back. But anyway, thanks so much for tuning out, guys, or tuning in. Tuning in. Thank you so much. I'm about to tune out. I'm tired after this. Thanks so much for tuning in. This has been Conrad Hamilton, Matt McManus. With Zero Books Capital comrades, and we will see you soon.
That's it.